I grew up watching my parents praise my sister while I learned how to disappear quietly. I thought being ignored was my flaw until the day she uncovered the truth about my life. The moment she saw the number $42 million, everything she believed about me collapsed. I didn't grow up thinking my parents were cruel. That realization came later. As a child, I simply believed there was a right way to exist in our family and that I hadn't been born knowing how to do it. My sister had that instinct naturally. She knew how to take up space, how to speak loudly enough to be noticed, but never loudly enough to be corrected. When she entered a room, my parents' attention followed her like gravity. Her achievements were announced at dinner, framed on walls, repeated to relatives. Mine were acknowledged in passing, if at all, usually with phrases like, "That's nice," or "You've always been so independent." Independent was their favorite word for me. They said it like praise, but it functioned more like a permission slip to ignore me. If my sister needed help, it was urgency. If I struggled, it was character building. If she failed, it was bad luck. If I succeeded, it was expected, and therefore unremarkable. Over time, I learned the rules without anyone spelling them out. Don't interrupt, don't ask for too much. Don't make things uncomfortable. I learned how to be agreeable, how to shrink reactions before they reached my face, how to swallow disappointment without making a sound. Silence became my safest option. What my parents never understood was that this silence wasn't emptiness, it was observation. While they were busy polishing my sister into the version of success they could show off, I was paying attention, learning how approval was given and withdrawn, how love was often tied to usefulness. I didn't rebel. I didn't compete. I adapted. And in doing so, I became very good at living a life no one thought to look for. The moment didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It came dressed as celebration, which somehow made it worse. My parents were hosting a small anniversary reception at a downtown venue, nothing extravagant, just enough polished glass and polite laughter to remind everyone that appearances mattered in our family. Brielle moved through the room like she owned it, greeting people with practiced warmth, accepting compliments as if they were inevitable. My parents stayed close to her, nodding proudly whenever her name was mentioned. I arrived quietly, as I always did. I had brought something simple with me, not expensive, not flashy, but personal. It was the kind of offering that only makes sense when you hope someone actually sees you. When I handed it to my mother, she smiled distractedly, already half turned toward Brielle. "What is it?" Brielle asked, peering over her shoulder. I explained, briefly. I didn't oversell it. I never did. She laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. "You always do things like this," she said, her tone light, almost affectionate. "So thoughtful. In your own way." My father chuckled, the sound quick and reflexive. My mother didn't correct her. She simply nodded, as if that settled something. The conversation moved on without me in it. Someone raised a glass. Someone else mentioned a promotion Brielle had just received. I stood there holding the empty space where my offering had been, feeling something unexpected rise up in me, not hurt, not anger, but clarity. I realized then that nothing about this moment was new. It was only visible because I'd stopped pretending otherwise. So, I excused myself. No announcement. No scene. I walked out into the evening air, my heels echoing softly against the pavement, and felt lighter with every step. For the first time, I wasn't leaving because I felt small. I was leaving because I finally understood my place in their story and why I no longer needed to play it. What my parents never noticed was not a secret I actively hid, it was a life they never asked about. While Brielle's world revolved around promotions, dinners, and being seen in the right places, mine was quieter by design. I learned early that visibility came with expectations I had no interest in carrying. So I built something different. Slowly, carefully, away from applause. After college, I took work no one in my family considered impressive. Long-term contracts, back-end roles, positions where results mattered more than titles. I saved aggressively, reinvested obsessively, and avoided anything that required explanation. There were no flashy purchases, no lifestyle upgrades that would invite questions. I treated stability like a discipline, not a reward. Most of what I built didn't live in bank accounts you checked casually. It lived in equity, in ownership structures, in decisions made years before they paid off. The kind of growth that looks boring until it suddenly isn't. There was one person who knew all of it, Marcus. He came into my life after the habits were already set. After the foundations were laid. He never asked me to prove anything. He understood the language I spoke fluently by then. Risk tolerance, long horizons, quiet control. When I told him I'd never shared any of it with my family, he didn't look surprised. They don't see you, he said once, not unkindly. So they don't know what they're missing. He was right. My parents still thought of me as the low-maintenance daughter. The one who didn't need help. The one who was doing fine. They never questioned why I never asked for money, never borrowed, never struggled publicly. They assumed I didn't aim very high. In truth, I aimed precisely. I built a life that didn't require their approval or their permission. And for a long time, that distance wasn't loneliness. It was protection. The truth didn't come out because I chose to reveal it. It surfaced the way things always do through someone else's carelessness. A week after the reception, Brielle called me in the middle of the afternoon. Her tone was strange. Too casual. The kind of casual people use when they already know the answer but want to hear you say it first. Quick question, she said. Do you know someone named Elara Quinn Holdings? I didn't answer right away. Not because I was afraid but because I recognized the moment for what it was. The hinge. The second before everything changed. She laughed lightly when I stayed quiet. I was just helping a friend look something up, she continued. Funny coincidence, right? It wasn't a coincidence, of course. She had followed a trail she wasn't meant to see, an outdated contact, a document left open, a name she hadn't expected to recognize. Curiosity had done the rest. Brielle had always been good at sensing opportunity. She was even better at sensing leverage. By the time she called, she already knew. The entity. The structure. The valuation. The number sat between us, unspoken but enormous. 42 million. I could hear her breathing change as she waited for me to deny it. When I didn't, the silence stretched thin and electric. That can't be right, she said finally, her voice tight. That has to be old. Or theoretical. It's accurate, I replied. Calmly. Another pause. I imagined her refreshing the page again, as if the number might shrink if she stared at it hard enough. Something in her shifted then. Not shock calculation. She didn't ask how I built it. She didn't ask why she hadn't known. She asked, why didn't you tell us? And in that moment, I understood exactly what the next phase would look like. Because the number hadn't surprised her. It had claimed her. Brielle didn't come to see me in person. She didn't need to. The entitlement traveled perfectly well through the phone. At first, she tried to sound hurt. She talked about family, about trust, about how strange it felt to discover something so important through a screen instead of from me. She said my name the way people do when they want to soften a demand before making it. But the mask didn't last. You didn't just forget to mention this, she said. You hid it. I corrected her calmly. I didn't hide anything. You never asked. To Boutwriter. That's when her tone hardened. She started listing memories, reframing them as investments. The dinners my parents paid for. The times they let me stay over between leases. The holidays where I brought nothing but myself and was still welcomed, she said, as if generosity had always flowed in one direction. They supported you, Brielle insisted. That counts for something. By the time my parents joined the call, the language had fully shifted. No one asked how I'd built what I had. No one expressed surprise at my discipline or relief that I was secure. The focus locked onto what they believed was now available. My mother spoke first. We just wish you'd trusted us, she said, her voice tight with disappointment. My father followed, quieter but firm. You're part of this family. Big decisions affect everyone. I realized then that the pattern hadn't broken, it had simply revealed its final form. My sister, once the favorite, had become the spokesperson. My parents, once dismissive, were suddenly attentive. Not because they saw me differently but because the number forced them to. Brielle leaned closer to the camera, her eyes sharp. You don't get to walk away with everything, she said. Not after all of us were there for you. There it was. The conclusion she'd reached without discussion. What I had built wasn't mine. It was overdue. And in that moment, I understood something with perfect clarity. Curiosity hadn't led her to me. Greed had. Once Brielle realized she wasn't being invited into my world, she stopped pretending she wanted to understand it. The calls became constant. If I didn't answer, she left messages long, breathless, spiraling. She accused me of betrayal, of manipulation, of deliberately humiliating her by succeeding in silence. Each message grew more frantic than the last, as if volume could replace leverage. "You let us look stupid," she shouted in one voicemail. "Do you know what people are saying?" What people were saying had nothing to do with me. But Brielle had never been good at separating image from identity. If her reflection cracked, she needed someone else to blame. My parents tried a different approach. My mother cried. My father warned me, calmly at first, then with growing edge, that I was tearing the family apart. They framed my refusal as cruelty, my boundaries as punishment. Every sentence carried the same unspoken belief that access to me, and to what I had built, was something they were owed. Brielle, meanwhile, unraveled in real time. She began reaching out to people she barely knew, former colleagues, distant relatives, anyone she thought might pressure me on her behalf. She showed up unannounced at my apartment building one evening, furious when the concierge refused to call up. "This isn't over," she hissed when I finally spoke to her through the intercom. "You can't freeze us out and expect this to go quietly." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I told her, simply, that she needed to leave. That was when the threats started: lawsuits she didn't understand, public exposure she couldn't execute, moral accusations that collapsed under their own weight. Each one revealed more than it concealed. This wasn't about fairness. It was about control. What none of them realized was that the meltdown wasn't changing my mind. It was confirming it. For years, I had been invisible because I had nothing they wanted. Now that I did, they couldn't see anything else. And in that clarity, something finally broke, just not in me. Emotional boundaries had never worked with my family. They heard feelings as invitations and restraint as weakness. So I stopped speaking in a language they could reinterpret. I spoke in structure. The first step was distance. I stopped answering calls altogether and routed everything through my attorney. Not as a threat, not as a performance, simply as a necessity. Any communication that came from my parents or Brielle was documented, time-stamped, and answered once, if at all. Next came clarity. My holdings were placed behind formal barriers, entities they had no standing to question and no leverage to penetrate. Every informal overlap I'd allowed in the past was closed. No shared advisors, no favors, no assumptions. When my parents tried to frame this as hostility, my lawyer responded with neutrality. There were no accusations, no emotional language. Only facts. Boundaries, it turns out, sound very different when they're written in legal terms. Brielle escalated briefly, threatening to contest things she didn't understand. The response was simple. She had no claim, no contribution, no entitlement. Once that reality was laid out in writing, her certainty evaporated. What surprised me wasn't how quickly the chaos stopped. It was how much quieter my life became once it did. For the first time, my safety didn't depend on my ability to stay calm or agreeable. It depended on systems that didn't care about guilt or history. Systems that functioned whether I explained myself or not. I didn't do this to punish them. I did it because I finally understood something essential. Boundaries that rely on goodwill fail when goodwill was never mutual. Structure doesn't argue. It simply holds. Without access to me, Brielle began to unravel in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with identity. She had always relied on proximity. To our parents, to approval, to being positioned as the one who mattered most. When that axis disappeared, she had no center left to stand on. The confidence she'd worn so easily began to crack, replaced by a frantic need to prove she was still important, still winning. She made impulsive decisions, public ones, loud ones. She overextended herself financially, chasing appearances she could no longer sustain. She talked too much, hinted at opportunities that didn't exist, borrowed credibility she hadn't earned. People noticed. Not with sympathy, but with distance. My parents tried to steady her, but they were unequipped for the role. They had spent decades protecting her from consequence, not preparing her for it. Every attempt to fix things only exposed how little foundation there actually was beneath her success. From the outside, it looked like stress. A rough patch. But I recognized the truth beneath it. Brielle wasn't losing money, she was losing the narrative that had always carried her. The one where effort was optional and outcomes were guaranteed. She reached out once more, months later. Not angry this time. Not demanding. Just tired. The message was short, almost careful. I don't understand how everything went wrong so fast. I read it without replying. Because nothing had gone wrong suddenly. It had only been revealed. The golden child hadn't been built to stand alone. She had been built to be admired, supported, excused. When those structures fell away, there was nothing left to prop her up. And for the first time, the collapse was hers alone to face. Walking away didn't feel dramatic. There was no final confrontation, no closing speech that tied everything into a neat ending. What I took with me wasn't something they could see or argue over. I took clarity. For most of my life, I believed that if I stayed patient enough, quiet enough, useful enough, the balance might shift. That eventually I'd be met with the same care I'd extended. Letting go of that hope hurt more than the fallout itself, but it also freed me. I didn't leave with bitterness. I left with understanding. I finally saw my family as they were, not as the version I kept trying to earn. Their affection had always been conditional, and conditions change when the leverage does. What I built, my work, my security, my independence, was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I could live without shrinking, that I could choose distance without guilt. The money stayed where it belonged, protected and purposeful. I redirected my attention toward what had always sustained me: steady effort, long horizons, and relationships that didn't require performance. If there's one thing I learned, it's this: being underestimated wasn't a disadvantage. It was a shelter. They didn't lose me when I stopped answering the phone. They lost me when they only learned my value after attaching a number to it. Before you leave, I want to speak to you directly, not as a character, but as someone who lived this. If you've ever been overlooked, minimized, or valued only when you became useful, I see you. If my choices resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Do you think I did the right thing, or would you have handled it differently? Your voice matters here. And if there's one lesson I hope you take into your own life, it's this: protect your boundaries before you're forced to defend them. Don't wait for permission to value yourself. Build quietly if you must, but build intentionally. And remember, love that depends on conditions isn't love. If this story gave you clarity or strength, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts below. Your engagement helps stories like this reach the people who need them most.